Before we begin, if stories of fateful encounters, the enduring ache of loss, and the unexpected miracles that can bloom in the heart of winter speak to your soul, then you've found a special place here with us. This is a narrative about a lonely man, his world quieted by grief, who on a desolate Christmas Eve opens his door to a lost, frightened teenager. He offers her shelter from the storm, completely unaware that this simple act of kindness is a beacon, a final, desperate link in a chain of events a decade in the making, a chain held by a father who has never, ever stopped searching. The revelation to come will not only change her life and his, but will redefine the very meaning of Christmas, family, and the threads that bind us. Hit subscribe and turn on those notifications, because this is a story of hope deferred, love unrelenting, and a reunion so profound it will restore your faith in the unbelievable. Now, let me take you to that snowy Christmas Eve, to a solitary cabin and a knock that would echo for a lifetime. Let the story begin. Elias Thorne lived a life carved from silence and shadows. His small cabin on the outskirts of Oak Haven more a hermitage than a home. The wind, a constant companion in the winter-locked valley, whistled through the eaves of the old log structure, a mournful sound that mirrored the hollow ache in Elias's own chest. It was Christmas Eve, a night the world cloaked in an almost aggressive cheer, but for Elias it was just another Tuesday, another marker of time past since joy had last felt like a familiar language. His wife, Clara, had been gone 5 years, taken by an illness that had swept through their lives like a sudden blizzard, leaving behind an emptiness that the crackling fire in his stone hearth could never quite fill. He had no children, no close family left. His days were a solitary routine, chopping wood, mending fences, reading worn paperbacks by the dim glow of an oil lamp, the silence broken only by the occasional howl of a distant wolf or the creak of the cabin settling around him. He wasn't unhappy, not exactly. He had found a stoic peace in his isolation, a predictability that shielded him from further hurt. But tonight, the loneliness felt sharper, the memories of Clara's laughter and the scent of her gingerbread cookies more poignant. He was stirring a meager pot of stew, the aroma of wild herbs and simmering broth a small comfort, when he heard it, a sound so out of place in his secluded world that he initially dismissed it as the wind playing tricks. A faint, desperate tapping at his front door. He froze, spoon mid-air. No one ever came to his door, especially not on Christmas Eve, especially not in a storm that was rapidly escalating from gentle snowfall to a blinding whiteout. He moved cautiously to the small, frost-covered window, peering out into the swirling snow. He could barely see the outline of his own porch. The tapping came again, more insistent this time, weaker. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years, Elias unlatched the heavy wooden door and pulled it open. The wind roared in, carrying a flurry of snow and a figure so small and insubstantial it seemed the storm might snatch her away. It was a girl, a teenager, no older than 16 or 17, though hardship had etched a premature weariness onto her delicate features. She was covered in snow, her thin, threadbare coat offering little protection against the biting cold. Her dark hair was plastered to her forehead, her lips were blue, and her eyes, large, frightened, and startlingly green, were wide with a desperate plea. She clutched a tattered, nearly empty backpack to her chest as if it were her only lifeline. She swayed slightly, her body trembling uncontrollably. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. Can I just, for a little while? Just until the snow stops?" Elias, a man who had deliberately shuttered his heart against the world, found himself looking into a pair of eyes that reminded him so achingly of Clara's in their vulnerability. He saw not a stranger, but a child, lost and freezing on the most sacred of nights. Without a word, he stepped back, holding the door wider. "Come in," he said, his voice gruff from disuse but not unkind. "Get out of that storm before you freeze solid." The girl stumbled inside, nearly collapsing onto the rough-hewn floorboards. Elias quickly closed the door, shutting out the howling wind, and the sudden silence of the cabin seemed to amplify her shivering. He helped her to the worn armchair closest to the fire, his movements gentle despite his own surprise. He piled more logs onto the hearth, coaxing the flames higher, their warmth slowly beginning to penetrate the chill that clung to her. He didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. He simply saw a need, and in that moment, on that desolate Christmas Eve, the lonely man with a heart he thought had long turned to stone did the only thing that felt right. He offered sanctuary. He ladled a steaming bowl of his stew, his hands, calloused from years of solitary labor, surprisingly steady. He placed it on a small, wobbly table beside her, along with a thick slice of the dense, dark bread he baked himself. The girl, whose name he didn't yet know, looked at the food as if she hadn't seen such abundance in a lifetime. Then, with trembling fingers, she picked up the spoon. As she ate, slowly at first, then with a quiet, desperate hunger, Elias watched her, his own meal forgotten. He saw the way her too thin wrists poked from the cuffs of her worn coat, the shadows beneath her eyes, the almost feral caution in her movements. This was not just a girl caught in a snowstorm. This was a girl who had been running, fighting, surviving, for a very long time. And as the warmth of the fire and the food began to seep into her, a single tear traced a path down her grimy cheek, a silent testament to an exhaustion so profound it had no words. Elias looked away, giving her the dignity of her private grief, but in his heart a forgotten door creaked open, letting in a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. It might have been Christmas, or it might have been compassion, reborn. The cabin, usually a bastion of Elias Thorne's solitude, now held a new, fragile presence. The girl, after consuming the stew with a quiet intensity that spoke volumes of her hunger, had succumbed to an exhausted sleep in Clara's old armchair, still wrapped in the thick woolen blanket Elias had draped over her. Her breathing was shallow but even, her face softened in repose, looking impossibly young and vulnerable against the worn, floral fabric. Elias sat across the room, near the hearth, the crackling fire the only sound apart from the girl's soft breaths and the relentless moan of the wind outside. He hadn't intended to keep vigil, but sleep eluded him. His mind, usually a quiet landscape of memory and routine, was now filled with questions. Who was this child? Where had she come from, and what horrors had driven her out into a Christmas Eve blizzard? He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just a runaway, but a reflection of a loneliness that mirrored his own, albeit born of different circumstances. He saw the resilience etched in the determined set of her jaw, even in sleep, and the faint, almost invisible scars, one tracing a thin white line above her eyebrow, another peeking from the collar of her tattered shirt, that hinted at a past far harsher than her years suggested. He remembered Clara, her fierce protectiveness, her belief that every lost soul deserved a safe harbor. He had tried to honor that in his own quiet way after she was gone, leaving out food for stray animals, mending the church roof anonymously, small acts of kindness that asked for nothing in return. But this felt different, more profound, more personal. This was a life, fragile and frightened, that had literally landed on his doorstep. The storm raged on through the night, a symphony of wind and snow that cocooned the small cabin in a world of its own. Elias dozed fitfully in his own chair, waking at every creak of the floorboards, every shift in the girl's breathing. It was a long time since another heartbeat had shared his silent space. Towards dawn, as the first pale light began to filter through the snow-caked windows, the girl stirred. She woke with a start, her eyes flying open, a flicker of panic in their green depths before they focused on her surroundings. The unfamiliar room, the dying embers in the hearth, the quiet man watching her. Elias offered a small, reassuring smile. "Morning," he said, his voice still raspy. "Or, what passes for it in this blizzard. Looks like we're snowed in proper." The girl sat up slowly, pushing her tangled dark hair from her face. She looked less like a cornered animal now, more like a weary traveler who had found an unexpected inn. I should go," she stammered, her voice hoarse. "The snow. It might have stopped." Elias gestured towards the window where the snow was still falling, thick and relentless. "Not likely, I'm afraid. And even if it had, the roads will be impassable for a day or two at least. You're safe here. There's more stew, and I think I can scare up some coffee." He didn't want to frighten her by seeming too eager for her to stay, but the thought of her venturing back out into that storm, alone and ill-equipped, was unbearable. The girl looked at him, her gaze searching, then nodded slowly. "Okay," she whispered. "Thank you." Over a breakfast of reheated stew and strong, bitter coffee, Elias's only concession to luxury, a fragile kind of communication began. "My name is Elias," he offered as he refilled her mug. The girl hesitated, then, "I'm Evangeline. Eva, mostly." "Eva," Elias repeated, the name feeling strangely familiar, though he couldn't place why. "That's a pretty name." Eva looked down at her hands, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. "Where were you headed, Eva, in a storm like this?" Elias asked gently, not pressing but unable to entirely suppress his concern. Eva's gaze clouded over. "Away," she said, her voice flat. "Just away from there." "From where?" Eva shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. The fear was back in her eyes, sharp and immediate. Elias held up a hand. "All right, no more questions. Not until you're ready." He changed the subject, talking instead about the deer he'd seen near the creek that morning, the way the snowdrifts were piling up against the barn. He spoke of simple things, the mundane details of his solitary life, and slowly he saw the tension in Eva's shoulders begin to ease again. She didn't offer much in return, just an occasional nod, a soft, but she was listening. And for Elias, who had grown accustomed to the sound of his own voice echoing in an empty house, her quiet presence was a strange, unsettling, yet not entirely unwelcome comfort. Later that morning, as Elias was splitting firewood on the sheltered back porch, Eva appeared in the doorway, wrapped in Clara's old, oversized wool cardigan she'd found neatly folded on the armchair. "Can I help?" she asked, her voice still hesitant. Elias paused, axe mid-swing. He looked at her thin frame, her pale face. "You sure? It's heavy work." Eva nodded, a flicker of determination in her eyes. "I'm stronger than I look." And she was. She stacked the split logs with a surprising efficiency, her movements economical, her focus intense. They worked in a companionable silence, the rhythmic thud of the axe and the clatter of wood the only sounds. As they worked, Elias noticed a small, intricately carved wooden bird clutched in her hand. She would occasionally run her thumb over its smooth surface, a gesture that seemed both unconscious and deeply comforting. He didn't ask about it, respecting her silence, but he filed the image away. It was another piece of the puzzle, another hint of the life she had left behind. By midday, the snow finally began to taper off, the wind softening to a whisper. The world outside was a pristine, untouched expanse of white. Elias knew that, eventually, he would have to contact the authorities, report finding Eva. It was the responsible thing to do. But as he looked at her, her face flushed from the exertion, a smudge of dirt on her cheek, a tentative, almost forgotten smile playing on her lips as she successfully stacked a particularly large log. A fierce, protective instinct rose within him. Not yet, he thought. Not yet. Let her have this day, this Christmas, in peace. Let her feel safe, just for a little while longer. Christmas Day dawned cold but clear, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue arching over a world transformed by the blizzard. The snow lay in deep, sculpted drifts, glittering in the sharp winter sunlight. Inside Elias Thorne's cabin, a fragile peace had settled. Eva, after a night of deeper, more restful sleep than she'd experienced in recent memory, woke to the scent of pine and something faintly spicy. Cinnamon, perhaps. Elias was in the kitchen, humming a tuneless, forgotten carol as he attempted to make pancakes from a recipe he'd found in one of Clara's old cookbooks. The results were, by his own admission, more like lumpy flapjacks, but Eva ate them with a genuine appreciation that warmed him more than the fire. There were no presents under a tree. Elias hadn't bothered with a tree in years. There were no festive decorations, no sounds of carols on the radio. Yet, in the quiet simplicity of their shared meal, in the unspoken understanding that had begun to weave itself between them, there was a sense of occasion, a quiet acknowledgment of the day's significance. After breakfast, Elias, bundled in his warmest coat and hat, announced he was going to check on his nearest neighbors, the Millers, an elderly couple who lived a mile down the snow-drifted road. "Their phone line's likely down," he said. "Just want to make sure they're all right. See if they need anything." He hesitated, then looked at Eva. "You'll be okay here on your own for a bit?" Eva nodded. The thought of being alone in the cabin didn't frighten her as it might have a day ago. There was a nascent sense of safety here, a feeling she was almost afraid to name. "I'll be fine," she said. "I can tidy up." Elias smiled. "Don't you worry about that. Just stay warm." After he left, the cabin felt both emptier and strangely more her own. She did tidy the small kitchen, washing the breakfast dishes with a thoroughness that spoke of a longing for order. Then, drawn by an impulse, she explored the small bookshelf in the living room. It was filled with Clara's books, well-worn novels, poetry collections, a few slim volumes on gardening and birdwatching. Tucked amongst them, she found a small, leather-bound journal. Hesitantly, she opened it. Clara's handwriting, elegant and flowing, filled the pages with observations about the changing seasons, sketches of wildflowers, snippets of poetry. There were no grand pronouncements, no dramatic confessions, just the quiet, intimate record of a life lived with a deep appreciation for the small beauties of the world. Eva felt a pang of connection to this woman she had never known, this woman whose presence still lingered in the scent of dried lavender tucked between the pages, in the faded floral fabric of the armchair, in the gentle kindness of the man she had loved. As she read, Eva's fingers unconsciously traced the outline of the small wooden bird in her pocket. It had been a gift from her mother, carved by her grandfather, one of the few tangible links to a past that felt increasingly distant, almost dreamlike. Her mother. The memory brought a fresh wave of pain, a suffocating fear. Where was she? Was she safe? Had she found shelter from the storm, from the men her father had called business associates, men with cold eyes and cruel smiles who had made their lives a living hell after her father's sudden, suspicious death? Her father, a renowned architect with a gentle soul and a dangerous secret, a meticulously documented ledger detailing a web of corruption and illicit dealings involving powerful, ruthless men. He had tried to break free, to expose them, and it had cost him his life. Her mother had grabbed Eva, the ledger, and run, their comfortable world shattering behind them. They had been on the run for months, living in shadows, always looking over their shoulders until that desperate, blizzard-swept night when her mother, terrified they were being closed in on, had pushed Eva towards the frozen lake, towards the distant lights of Oakhaven, whispering, "Survive, Eva. Live. Don't let them win." The memory was a fresh wound. Eva closed Clara's journal, her heart aching. She couldn't stay here, couldn't endanger Elias. He had shown her kindness, a generosity she hadn't known existed. She couldn't repay that by bringing her shadowed world to his doorstep. When Elias returned, his cheeks ruddy from the cold, his pockets bulging with cookies Mrs. Miller had pressed upon him, he found Eva by the fire, her tattered backpack at her feet. "The roads are still mostly blocked," he said, stamping snow from his boots. "But the plows should be through by tomorrow morning, they reckon." Eva looked at him, her green eyes filled with a sorrow that mirrored his own. "Elias," she began, her voice trembling slightly, I I have to go." Elias's smile faded. He set the cookies on the table. "Go? Where, Eva? The storm." "It's not about the storm," she said, her voice gaining a desperate urgency. It's complicated. I can't stay here. I can't put you in danger." "Danger?" Elias frowned. "What kind of danger?" Eva hesitated. Then the words came tumbling out, a torrent of fear and grief, about her father, the ledger, the men hunting them, her mother's desperate sacrifice. She showed him the small wooden bird, the only memento she had of a life that felt like a lifetime ago. Elias listened in stunned silence, his initial confusion giving way to a grim understanding. He had seen his share of darkness in the world, but this was a different kind of cold. When she finished, her voice hoarse, her shoulders shaking, Elias didn't speak for a long moment. He walked to the window, staring out at the pristine, snow-covered landscape, a landscape that suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a fragile illusion. Finally, he turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "Your mother," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "She wanted you to survive. She entrusted you to the storm, to chance, hoping someone good would find you." He paused. "Someone did." Eva looked at him, tears welling in her eyes. "But Elias, they'll find me. They always do. And they'll hurt anyone who helps me." Elias walked towards her, his gaze steady. "Then let them try," he said, his voice resonating with a strength Eva hadn't heard in it before. "This cabin, this land, it's seen its share of storms, Eva. It's still standing, and so am I." He reached out and gently took the small wooden bird from her trembling hand, his calloused fingers surprisingly tender. "You're not alone in this anymore," he said. "Whatever comes, we'll face it. Together." And as the Christmas sun dipped below the snow-covered peaks, casting long, blue shadows across the valley, Elias Thorne, the lonely man who thought his heart had frozen over, made a choice. He chose not to be alone anymore. He chose to stand, to protect, to fight for the lost girl who had stumbled into his life and, in doing so, had reawakened a part of him he thought was long dead. Christmas, he realized, wasn't just about memories of the past. It was about the brave, terrifying, and profoundly hopeful act of choosing the future. The days following Christmas unfolded with a deceptive quiet. The blizzard had passed, leaving Oakhaven draped in a thick blanket of snow that muffled sounds and slowed the pace of life to a crawl. The plows eventually cleared the main roads, but Elias's cabin, nestled deep in the woods, remained relatively isolated, a small pocket of stillness in a world that Eva knew was anything but. She had tried, in the initial aftermath of her confession, to convince Elias to let her leave, to find her own way, to spare him the danger she was convinced she carried like a contagious disease. But Elias had been uncharacterable. "This is your home now, Eva," he'd stated, not unkindly but with a finality that brooked no argument. "And we don't abandon family, no matter how complicated things get." Family. The word had resonated deep within Eva, a bittersweet ache. She hadn't known the true meaning of it for so long. Her own family had been shattered, first by her father's murder, then by her mother's desperate flight. Now, this quiet, solitary man, a stranger just days ago, was offering her a place at his hearth, a share in his life, a steadfastness she hadn't dared to hope for. And so, she stayed. She helped Elias with the daily chores, chopping firewood, hauling water from the well when the pipes froze, mending his worn work clothes with the neat practice stitches her mother had taught her. She learned the rhythms of his quiet life, the way he liked his coffee, strong and black, the worn patches on the floorboards he instinctively avoided, the way he would pause in his work sometimes, his gaze distant, lost in a memory she knew involved Clara. In the evenings they would sit by the fire, Elias reading aloud from one of Clara's poetry books, his voice a low, comforting rumble, while Eva sketched in a pad he'd found for her, her pencils flying across the page, bringing to life the fantastical creatures and resilient heroines that populated her inner world. She didn't talk much about her past, and Elias didn't press. He understood that some wounds needed silence to heal, but occasionally a fragment would emerge, a childhood memory of her father teaching her to identify constellations, a fleeting mention of her mother's love for wildflowers. Each small revelation was a precious thread, weaving her story, however tentatively, into the fabric of his. He, in turn, shared pieces of his own life, stories of his firefighting days, the camaraderie, the losses, the quiet pride in a job well done. He spoke of Clara, not with overt grief, but with a gentle, enduring love that made Eva's heart ache for what they had lost and for what she herself had never known. The greatest change, however, was in Elias himself. The profound loneliness that had been his constant companion for 5 years began to recede, replaced by a sense of purpose, of connection. Eva's presence had breathed life back into the silent cabin, her quiet industry, her shy smiles, her very vulnerability, chipping away at the ice that had formed around his heart. He found himself looking forward to their evenings by the fire, to the small, shared moments of domesticity. He even started humming again, forgotten tunes from his youth, much to his own surprise. But beneath the surface of their quiet routine, an unspoken tension simmered. Eva knew the men her father had crossed were not the type to give up easily. They were powerful, ruthless, and they would not rest until they had retrieved the ledger her mother had so desperately tried to protect. The ledger Eva now knew was her only real leverage, her only hope for justice, and potentially her death warrant. She hadn't told Elias where her mother had hidden it, a secret too dangerous to share, a burden she felt she had to carry alone. Elias, too, was not naive. He knew that Eva's past would eventually catch up with them. He started taking precautions, subtle at first, checking the locks more frequently, keeping his old hunting rifle cleaned and oiled, his senses on high alert whenever he ventured into Oak Haven for supplies. He also made a few discreet inquiries, calling in old favors from his firefighting days, trying to get a sense of who these business associates of Eva's father might be, how far their reach extended. The answers he received were unsettling, painting a picture of a shadowy organization with tendrils in legitimate businesses and illicit enterprises alike, an organization that did not tolerate loose ends. One afternoon, while Elias was in town, Eva was alone in the cabin, mending a tear in one of Clara's old quilts. A sudden, sharp knock on the door made her jump, her heart leaping into her throat. She froze, her needle poised mid-stitch. It wasn't Elias's familiar, deliberate knock. This was different, sharper, more insistent. She crept to the window, her breath catching in her chest, and peered through a crack in the curtains. A sleek, black sedan, out of place on their snow-covered track, was parked near the tree line. 2 men in dark suits stood on the porch. They didn't look like they were selling encyclopedias. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. They had found her. She backed away from the window, her mind racing. Elias had shown her a loose floorboard under his bed, a small, hidden space where he kept a few precious mementos of Clara's. "If there's ever trouble," he'd said, his voice casual but his eyes serious. "And I'm not here. You know what to do." She hadn't asked what he meant. Now she understood. She raced to the bedroom, her hands trembling, and pried open the loose floorboard. She hesitated for only a second, then reached into the tattered lining of her backpack and pulled out a slim, leather-bound ledger. Her father's legacy. Her burden. Her only weapon. She thrust it into the hidden space, replaced the floorboard, and smoothed the rug over it just as the knocking came again, louder this time, more demanding. Taking a deep breath, steeling herself, Eva walked to the door. She knew this was just the beginning. The real storm was about to break. The 2 men on Elias Thorne's porch were an unwelcome intrusion of a world Eva had desperately tried to leave behind. They were impeccably dressed in dark, tailored suits that seemed to absorb the muted winter light, their faces impassive, their eyes cold and watchful. They exuded an aura of quiet menace, a predatory stillness that made the hairs on the back of Eva's neck prickle. She knew their type. She had seen them hovering in the periphery of her father's life, silent, observant, their loyalty bought, not earned. "Evangeline Hollowell?" the taller of the two men asked, his voice smooth, devoid of inflection. He used her full formal name, a name she hadn't heard in months, a name that felt like a brand. Eva nodded, her throat tight, her hands clenched at her sides. She tried to project an outward calm she was far from feeling. "May I help you?" The man offered a thin, humorless smile. "We're associates of your late father, Mr. Jonathan Hollowell. We've been concerned about your welfare, and about certain assets that rightfully belong to his estate." Assets? The ledger? Eva's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I have nothing that belongs to anyone else." The second man, shorter, stockier, with a scar that traced a jagged line across his cheek, took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "Don't play games with us, girl. We know your mother had it, and we know she passed it to you before she disappeared." Disappeared. The word hung in the frigid air, heavy with unspoken threat. Eva felt a chill seep into her bones, colder than any winter wind. "My mother is missing," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts. "If you know something about that, you should tell the police." The taller man chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. "The police? My dear, we are often far more efficient than the police. We're here to offer you a simple proposition. Return what isn't yours, and we can all put this unfortunate business behind us. No fuss, no unpleasantness." His gaze flickered past her into the small, rustic cabin, a silent assessment of her current, humble circumstances. "Surely a smart girl like you can see the wisdom in cooperation." Eva stood her ground, though every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide. But where could she go that they wouldn't find her? And, more importantly, she thought of Elias, of the quiet sanctuary he had offered her, the unexpected kindness that had begun to thaw the ice around her heart. She wouldn't lead them to him, wouldn't endanger him. "I have nothing for you," she repeated, her voice gaining a new, steely resolve. "And I think you should leave." The stocky man's eyes glinted with anger, and he took another step forward, his hand reaching inside his coat. But before he could move further, a new voice cut through the tense silence, calm but carrying an undeniable authority. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" Elias Thorne stood in the doorway of the barn, a heavy woodsman's axe resting casually on his shoulder, his gaze fixed on the two men. He had approached silently, his movements masked by the wind and the thick layer of snow. He looked, Eva thought with a sudden surge of relief, like a guardian spirit of the mountains, rugged, indomitable. The two men turned, their composure momentarily shaken by Elias's unexpected appearance. They hadn't anticipated interference. "This doesn't concern you, old man," the taller one said, recovering quickly, his voice laced with contempt. "This is a private family matter." Elias's eyes narrowed. "This is my property," he said, his voice a low rumble. "And this young lady is under my protection. So, yes, it very much concerns me." He took a step forward, the axe shifting slightly on his shoulder, a subtle but unmistakable warning. "Now, unless you have a warrant or a legitimate reason to be here, I suggest you get back in your fancy car and drive away before I decide to call Sheriff Brody and report a trespassing complaint. He takes a dim view of city folk bothering his constituents, especially on a Christmas holiday." The two men exchanged a look. They were accustomed to intimidation, to wielding power through veiled threats and expensive lawyers. They were not accustomed to dealing with solitary mountain men with axes and an unwavering look of determination in their eyes. The taller man hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "This isn't over, Miss Hollowell," he said, his gaze returning to Eva, cold and promising. "We will be in touch." He gave a curt nod to his associate, and they turned and walked back to their black sedan, their movements stiff with frustrated anger. They didn't look back. As the car disappeared down the snow-covered track, leaving only the whisper of tires on snow, Eva let out a shuddering breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her legs felt weak, and she leaned against the doorframe for support. Elias was beside her in an instant, his hand gently on her arm. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Eva nodded, unable to speak, tears welling in her eyes. He led her inside, back to the warmth of the fire. "They know," she whispered, her voice choked. "They know I'm here." "We knew they would, eventually," Elias said grimly. "But they also know you're not alone anymore." He stoked the fire, his movements deliberate, thoughtful. "That ledger, Eva, it's dangerous. More dangerous than you realize if men like that are coming after it." "I know," she said, her voice barely audible. It's evidence of terrible things. My father, he was trying to expose them. And they killed him for it," Elias finished quietly. Eva nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Elias sat beside her, his presence a solid, comforting weight. "Your mother was very brave," he said. "She tried to protect you, to give you a chance." "But what if they find her, Elias?" Eva cried, the fear she had suppressed for so long finally breaking through. "What if they hurt her because of me, because of that damn ledger?" Elias put a comforting arm around her shaking shoulders. "We won't let that happen," he said, his voice fierce. "We will find a way. There has to be a way to bring these people to justice, to keep you and your mother safe." He looked into her tear-filled eyes, his own gaze unwavering. "But you can't do it alone, Eva. And you don't have to anymore." For a long moment, Eva just looked at him, at this quiet, solitary man who had opened his door to a stranger, who had offered her not just shelter, but courage and an unexpected, fiercely protective loyalty. And in that moment, she knew he was right. She couldn't keep running. It was time to fight back. But first, she had to trust him. Truly trust him, with the one secret she had guarded so desperately. "Elias," she said, her voice gaining a new strength, "there's something I need to show you. Something my mother made me promise to protect, no matter what." The decision to reveal the ledger's hiding place was not one Eva made lightly. It was the last, most dangerous secret she possessed, the key to her father's legacy and the source of her deepest fears. But looking into Elias's steady, compassionate eyes, she knew she could no longer carry this burden alone. The trust he had shown her, the unwavering protection he offered, demanded an equal measure of courage from her. Later that evening, after the unsettling encounter with her father's associates had cast a somber pall over the cabin, Eva led Elias to his small, rustic bedroom. The room was sparsely furnished, dominated by a sturdy, handmade bed and a single, scarred wooden chest at its foot. The air smelled faintly of cedar and old books. With trembling hands, Eva knelt beside the bed and, following Elias's earlier, almost forgotten instructions, located the loose floorboard he had once pointed out. It creaked protestingly as she pried it open, revealing a shallow, dust-lined space beneath. Reaching deep into the tattered lining of her backpack, which she still kept close, she retrieved the slim, leather-bound volume. Her father's ledger. She held it for a moment, its familiar weight both a comfort and a terror, then passed it to Elias. "This is it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This is what they want. This is why they killed him." Elias took the ledger with a gravity that acknowledged its significance. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he looked at Eva, his gaze searching. "Are you sure about this, Eva? Once I see what's in here, there's no going back. For either of us." Eva met his gaze, her own green eyes filled with a new, steely resolve. "I'm sure, Elias," she said. "I'm tired of running, and I trust you." The simple declaration hung in the air, profound and transformative. Elias nodded slowly, then sat on the edge of the bed, the ledger resting in his lap. He opened it carefully, the old leather creaking softly. The pages were filled with her father's neat, precise handwriting. Columns of names, dates, figures, interspersed with cryptic notes and coded references. It was, as Eva had said, a meticulous record of illicit transactions, a blueprint of corruption that implicated powerful men in high places. As Elias read, his expression grew grimmer, the lines around his mouth tightening. He was no stranger to the darker side of human nature, but the scale of the greed and ruthlessness detailed in these pages was staggering. He understood now why these men were so desperate to retrieve it, why they would stop at nothing to silence anyone who knew of its existence. When he finally closed the ledger, a long, heavy silence filled the room. "Your father was a brave man, Eva," he said at last, his voice rough with emotion. "And a very dangerous one to people like this." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of awe and a fierce, protective anger. "No wonder they're hunting you. This could bring down an entire empire." "My mother hoped it would," Eva said, her voice quiet. "She believed that if the truth came out, they couldn't hurt us anymore. But she also knew it could get us killed." Elias ran a hand over his weary face. He was just a retired firefighter, a solitary man living a quiet life in the mountains. He was not equipped to take on a shadowy organization with seemingly limitless resources and a clear disregard for human life. But then he looked at Eva, at the fragile hope that flickered in her eyes, at the quiet courage that had kept her alive through unimaginable horrors, and he knew he couldn't turn away. He wouldn't. "All right," he said, his voice firm, decisive. "We need a plan. We can't just sit here and wait for them to come back, and they will come back." Over the next few days, Elias's cabin became a fortress of quiet determination. He and Eva pored over the ledger, Elias using his old investigative skills, honed from years of sifting through the ashes of fires to find their cause, to decipher her father's cryptic notes, to piece together the complex web of names and connections. Eva, with her intimate knowledge of her father's world, provided invaluable insights, translating his coded language, identifying key players. They worked late into the night, fueled by coffee and a shared sense of urgency. Elias also reached out to his old network, the Brotherhood of Firefighters, men he had trusted with his life countless times. He spoke to his former captain, a man named Frank O'Malley, a seasoned veteran with a sharp mind and an unshakable moral compass. He didn't reveal everything, not yet, but he hinted at a dangerous situation, a young woman in need of protection, powerful enemies. Frank, without hesitation, promised his support, his network of contacts, his discreet assistance. "You just say the word, Elias," Frank had said, his voice gruff but reassuring. "We look after our own, and anyone under your roof is one of us now." The small cabin, once a haven of solitude, now buzzed with a quiet, focused energy. The threat was still there, a palpable presence just beyond their doorstep, but now it was met not with fear, but with a steely resolve. Eva, for the first time, felt like she wasn't just surviving, she was fighting back, and she wasn't alone. She had Elias, a man whose quiet strength was a shield, and now an unseen army of men who, like him, understood the meaning of loyalty and courage. The ledger was no longer just her burden, it was their shared weapon. And as they worked together, a new, unspoken bond formed between them, a partnership forged in shared danger and a mutual determination to see justice done, no matter the cost. The quiet before the storm is often the most unsettling. Days turned into a week, then 2, and still the black sedan and its menacing occupants did not return to Elias Thorne's cabin. The snow-covered landscape around Oakhaven remained pristine, almost deceptively peaceful. But neither Elias nor Eva allowed themselves to be lulled into a false sense of security. They knew their adversaries were not the type to simply give up. This was merely a pause, a strategic retreat perhaps, while more persuasive methods were being considered. Elias used the time wisely. With Frank O'Malley's discreet help, he began to put safeguards in place. Old hunting trails around his property were subtly altered, deadfalls arranged to discourage unwelcome vehicular access. He re-established contact with a few trusted friends in law enforcement in the nearest city, men he'd known from his firefighting days who had moved on to detective work, feeding them carefully curated, anonymous tips about potential financial irregularities linked to some of the names in Jonathan Hollowell's ledger. He was planting seeds, hoping some might take root in fertile ground, creating official inquiries that might make Eva's pursuers more cautious. Eva, meanwhile, threw herself into creating a meticulously organized summary of the ledger's contents, translating her father's coded entries into clear, actionable information. Her mind, sharp and analytical, proved to be as formidable a weapon as any Elias possessed. She worked with a quiet intensity, her earlier fear now channeled into a focused determination. The small cabin became their command center, the kitchen table littered with notes, maps, and copies of the ledger's most damning pages. They developed a quiet rhythm, a partnership born of necessity and a deepening mutual respect. Eva learned to anticipate Elias's needs, a fresh mug of coffee appearing at his elbow just as his was growing cold, a pertinent page from the ledger handed to him before he even asked. Elias, in turn, marveled at her resilience, her intellect, her unwavering courage in the face of such overwhelming odds. He saw not just a victim, but a warrior. He also saw the toll this constant vigilance was taking on her. The shadows under her eyes were darker, her already slender frame thinner. He made sure she ate, that she rested, though he knew her sleep was often troubled. He would find her sometimes late at night, staring into the dying embers of the fire, the small wooden bird clutched in her hand, her expression lost and unutterably sad. In those moments, he wouldn't speak, wouldn't intrude on her private grief, but his presence, a silent, steadfast vigil, offered a comfort words could not. One evening, as they were reviewing a particularly complex section of the ledger, Eva paused, her finger tracing a name, Alistair Finch, a prominent philanthropist, a pillar of society, a man whose public image was impeccable. "My father trusted him," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He thought Finch was an ally, someone who could help him expose the others." She looked at Elias, her eyes filled with a chilling realization. "But Finch's name is... It's all through here. He wasn't an ally, Elias. He was one of them. Maybe even the one in charge." The revelation hung heavy in the air. If a man like Alistair Finch was involved, their enemies were even more powerful, more deeply entrenched than they had imagined. Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach, but he kept his expression calm for Ava's sake. "It changes things," he said grimly, "but it doesn't change what we have to do." He knew then that they couldn't simply wait for the official investigations to bear fruit. They needed something more, something to force Finch and his associates out of the shadows, to expose them before they could silence Eva permanently. The upcoming annual Oakhaven Winter Charity Gala, a glittering event that drew the wealthy and influential from across the state, suddenly loomed large in his mind. Alistair Finch was always a keynote speaker, his presence a highlight of the evening. It was a public forum, a place where secrets were usually buried under layers of champagne and polite smiles. But what if, Elias thought, what if it could also be a place where truth, however unwelcome, could be brought to light? It was a dangerous idea, fraught with risk, but as he looked at Eva, at the quiet strength that radiated from her despite her fear, he knew they had to try. They had to take the fight to them. "Eva," he said, his voice low and serious, "I think I know how we can make them listen, but it's going to be dangerous, and you'll have to be braver than you've ever been." Eva met his gaze, her own green eyes, no longer haunted by fear, but blazing with a fierce, unyielding resolve. "I learned from the best, Elias," she said, a faint, determined smile touching her lips. "Tell me what we need to do." The Oakhaven Winter Charity Gala was the social event of the season, a glittering affair held in the town's historic Grand Ballroom, a relic of a more opulent era. It was a night where the state's wealthy and influential gathered to see and be seen, to exchange pleasantries and broker power deals under the guise of philanthropy. Alistair Finch, as always, was the guest of honor, his presence lending an air of unimpeachable respectability to the proceedings. Elias and Eva arrived not through the grand front entrance, but through a discreet service door, thanks to a carefully orchestrated plan involving Frank O'Malley and a few sympathetic members of the ballroom staff who owed Frank favors. Eva looked stunning, transformed. She wore a simple, elegant black dress Elias had found in Clara's cedar chest, a dress Clara had worn only once, to their own modest wedding reception. It fit Eva as if it had been made for her, its timeless lines accentuating her slender grace. Her dark hair was swept up, revealing the delicate line of her neck, her green eyes, usually so guarded, now shining with a nervous, focused intensity. In her hand, she clutched a small, unassuming envelope. Elias, in a borrowed suit that felt stiff and unfamiliar, stayed in the shadows, a silent, watchful guardian. His role was to ensure Eva's safety, to be her anchor in the storm he knew was about to break. Their plan was audacious, desperate. Eva was to approach Alistair Finch directly, during a quiet moment, and present him with a carefully selected, damning page from her father's ledger, a page that directly implicated Finch in a high-level bribery scheme. She wouldn't make accusations, wouldn't cause a scene. She would simply hand him the evidence, look him in the eye, and let him know that she knew, that the truth was out there, and that it could no longer be buried. It was a gamble, a high-stakes play designed to rattle Finch, to force his hand, perhaps to make him careless. As Finch mingled, his practiced charm on full display, Eva took a deep breath and moved towards him. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her steps were steady. She intercepted him near a secluded alcove, away from the main throng. "Mr. Finch," she said, her voice clear and surprisingly calm. Finch turned, his polite smile faltering slightly as he registered the intensity in her gaze. "Yes? Do I know you, my dear?" "My name is Evangeline Hollowell," Eva said, her voice unwavering. "Jonathan Hollowell was my father." Finch's smile vanished. A flicker of something cold and calculating entered his eyes. "Ah, yes, a tragic loss. My deepest condolences." "Thank you," Eva said, her gaze holding his. "I believe this belongs to you." She handed him the envelope. Finch took it, his eyes narrowing. He opened it, his expression shifting from surprise to a barely concealed fury as he registered the contents. "What is the meaning of this?" he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "This is slander, blackmail." "It's the truth, Mr. Finch," Eva said quietly. "My father's truth. And I have the rest of it. All of it." Finch's eyes darted around, assessing the situation, his mind clearly racing. He saw Elias step out from the shadows, his presence a silent, formidable warning. He saw Frank O'Malley, in his dress uniform, standing near the ballroom entrance, his gaze fixed on them. Finch was a man accustomed to control, to manipulating events from behind the scenes. He was not accustomed to being cornered, to being publicly confronted with his own corruption. His composure began to crack. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, girl," he snarled, his voice a venomous whisper. "This will destroy you." "Perhaps," Eva said, her voice still calm but with an undercurrent of steel. "But it will also destroy you. And I am no longer afraid of being destroyed, Mr. Finch. I've already walked through that fire. The question is, are you prepared to?" Before Finch could respond, Frank O'Malley approached, flanked by two uniformed officers. "Mr. Finch," Frank said, his voice polite but firm. I believe Detective Reynolds from the State Investigation Bureau would like a word with you. It seems some rather interesting financial documents have recently come to light." Finch's face went pale. He looked from Frank to Eva to Elias, his expression a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. The trap had been sprung. As Finch was discreetly escorted away, a ripple of confusion and hushed whispers spreading through the ballroom, Eva felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her, so profound she swayed slightly. Elias was there instantly, his arm steadying her. "You did it, Eva," he said, his voice filled with a quiet pride. "You faced him. You spoke your truth." Eva leaned against him, tears of relief, of grief, of a hard-won victory, finally beginning to fall. The fight wasn't over, she knew. There would be legal battles, repercussions. But tonight, for the first time, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't dared to hope for. A future. A future where she wasn't running, where she wasn't hiding, where she could, perhaps, finally be free. And as she looked at Elias, at this quiet, solitary man who had become her unlikely protector, her steadfast ally, her dearest friend, she knew that whatever came next, she wouldn't have to face it alone. The Oakhaven Winter Charity Gala became the stuff of local legend, not for its glittering chandeliers or its champagne fountains, but for the quiet, dramatic takedown of Alistair Finch, a man whose carefully constructed facade of philanthropy had crumbled under the weight of a single, damning page from a dead man's ledger. The ensuing investigation, fueled by the contents of Jonathan Hollowell's meticulously kept records, sent shockwaves through the state's political and financial establishments. Arrests were made, reputations shattered, and a complex web of corruption, years in the making, began to unravel. Eva Hollowell, the lost girl who had stumbled out of a blizzard, became an unwitting symbol of courage and resilience. Her story whispered in hushed, admiring tones throughout Oakhaven and beyond. But for Eva, the public spectacle was merely a means to an end. Her true victory lay not in Finch's downfall, but in the fragile, hard-won peace that began to settle over her life. With Finch and his associates neutralized, the immediate threat that had haunted her for so long finally receded. She was no longer looking over her shoulder, no longer living in the shadows. The search for her mother, however, remained an agonizing, unanswered question. Elias, with Frank O'Malley's help, poured all his resources into finding any trace of Amelia Hollowell. They followed faint leads, interviewed old contacts, pieced together fragmented sightings. It was a slow, painstaking process, fraught with dead ends and disappointments. Eva oscillated between hope and despair, clinging to the small wooden bird her mother had given her, a tangible link to a love that felt both impossibly distant and ever-present. During this uncertain time, Elias's cabin remained her sanctuary, his quiet, unwavering support her anchor. Their bond, forged in shared danger and a deepening mutual affection, had blossomed into a love that was as unexpected as it was profound. It was a love built not on grand romantic gestures, but on shared silences, quiet acts of kindness and the deep, unspoken understanding of two souls who had found solace in each other's company. They never explicitly named it, never defined it, but it was there, a steady, warming presence in the heart of their shared solitude. One crisp spring morning, months after the gala, Frank O'Malley arrived at the cabin, his usually jovial face uncharacteristically solemn. He carried a small, sealed envelope. "We found her, Eva," he said gently, his voice filled with a compassion that made Eva's heart stop. "Your mother. She's safe." Amelia Hollowell had been living under an assumed name in a remote coastal town, working as a librarian, her life a quiet testament to her own resilience and her fierce determination to protect her daughter. The news that Finch was no longer a threat, that Eva was safe and had found a protector in Elias, was the answer to prayers she had whispered into the ocean wind for years. The reunion, when it finally happened, was a torrent of tears, laughter, and a love that had endured unimaginable separation. Amelia, her green eyes so like Eva's, radiating a quiet strength, embraced her daughter with a fierceness that spoke of years of fear and longing. She then turned to Elias, her gaze searching, grateful. "You saved her," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You gave her back to me." Elias, his own eyes suspiciously bright, simply nodded. "She saved me too, Amelia," he said softly. With her mother safe and the shadows of her past finally receding, Eva began to truly build a future. The idea of a healing retreat, a sanctuary for those who, like her, had been lost and broken, took root in her heart. With the considerable inheritance from her father's estate, which was finally, rightfully hers, and with Elias by her side, she purchased the land adjoining his cabin, a beautiful, wild expanse of forest and meadow. Together they began to dream, to plan, to build. They called it Hollowell Haven, a place of peace, of healing, of second chances. It wasn't just a retreat, it was a testament to the enduring power of hope, a legacy for her father, a sanctuary for her mother, and a home for the unconventional family they had become. Elias, his solitary life now filled with a love and purpose he had never expected, found a joy he thought had been lost to him forever. He worked alongside Eva, his strong hands helping to raise the beams of the new cabins, his quiet wisdom guiding their plans. He was no longer just a retired firefighter, he was a builder of dreams, a guardian of hope. Years later, on a warm summer evening, Elias and Eva stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, now the heart of Hollowell Haven. Children's laughter drifted from the nearby meadow, where Amelia, her face serene and joyful, was teaching a group of young guests to identify wildflowers. The small wooden bird Eva had once clutched as her only lifeline now sat on the mantelpiece inside, a cherished symbol of a journey completed, a promise fulfilled. Eva leaned her head on Elias's shoulder, her hand finding his, their fingers intertwining. "We did it, Elias," she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet wonder. "We built something beautiful." Elias looked out at the haven they had created, at the lives they were touching, at the love that surrounded them, and smiled. "No, Eva," he said, his voice soft but certain. "We didn't just build something beautiful. We became something beautiful." And as the sun set over Oak Haven, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold, the lonely man who had taken in a lost teen on a desolate Christmas Eve, and the girl who had found not just shelter but a love that healed all wounds, stood together, their journey a testament to the extraordinary miracles that can bloom from the simplest acts of kindness in the most unexpected of places. Wow, what a journey! Elias and Eva's story, beginning with a desperate knock on a cabin door on a stormy Christmas Eve, truly shows us how one act of compassion can set in motion a chain of events that leads to healing, justice, and the most unexpected, beautiful kinds of love and family. It reminds us that even in the deepest winter of our lives, hope can take root and blossom. But now, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments below, where in the world are you watching from today? And what was the moment in Elias and Eva's story that resonated with you the most? Was it Elias's quiet courage, Eva's incredible resilience, or perhaps the powerful theme of a father's enduring, protective love? Your thoughts and reflections mean so much to us. If you enjoyed this story of second chances, found family, and the quiet miracles that can unfold when we open our hearts, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications. That way, you'll always be the first to know when we share another inspiring tale. And if this story truly touched you and kept you with us until the very end, please show your appreciation by giving this video a big thumbs up. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing these heartfelt narratives to you. Thank you so much for watching and for being a cherished part of our community. See you in the next.